Hello, thank you for inviting me here. I'm interested to know how it works with the translations. I haven't done a presentation before with simultaneous translation, so I hope I don't go too fast. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction. The school I work at has been very helpful over many years in helping to fund research, intervention research into the practical strategies that we use. And they've now decided to promote this even more. So we have set up a research and training institute so that we can do more research than we have done in the past. So they're recognising that carrying out research really helps the children in the school, the professionals, and also the wider community. So I'm very grateful to them. So first, to give you just a bit of background as to how I have got to where I am and what my background is. So my speech and language therapy background, I started as an assistant in special schools, working with the speech and language therapist who would give me activities to carry out with the children. Following that, I did a Màster's in Speech and Language Pathology, which led to my qualification as a speech and language therapist. My first job was with speech and language therapists, with children aged between 2 years and 16 years, working in 4 different clinics and nurseries and mainstream schools. So it was a very large caseload. I think there were 300 children on my caseload, and it was very difficult to manage. Following that, I went to something more restricted. So I had children aged 2 to 5 years. I was working in clinics and nurseries, and also a special unit for children with hearing impairment. However, the majority of my time as a speech and language therapist has been working at Morehouse School and College. I started working there full-time, but then I carried out a PhD where I was working 3 days a week in the school, and I carried out the PhD 2 days a week. More recently, I've been working in research and development. This was funded by the school for 2 days per week, and then later they added an additional day per fortnight for me to give training courses to speech and language therapists. And so all of this time I've been at Morehouse School, and the new role, which I've been doing for 2 months now, is research and training, and now I've got 4 days a week, so I have more time to do more work. And my PhD was at UCL, and I've had links with UCL all the way through, so that's University College London. And I'm still working with them, and we're trying to set up more formal links as well to help research and practice join together much more. So the school, just to give you a bit of background, it opened in 1947, so it's our 70th birthday this year. And they had a celebration yesterday at school, which I missed because I was here, but never mind. And it's a specialist school and college for children with language disorders. So some have autism spectrum disorder, some have hearing impairments, but the majority have developmental language disorder, or which is the new name for specific language impairment. And even those who have other difficulties, the language is their main problem. About 80% of the children have difficulties understanding language, so these are the more severe cases. The age range is now from 7 to 19 years. It used to be till 16 years, but in 2012 we opened a college for 16 to 19-year-olds, so this is a new area for us. There are both day placements, and also from 11 years they can stay at the school during the week, so there are residential placements as well. This is particularly used in the college for the 16 to 19-year-olds, where they learn a lot of life skills, so they will do all their own shopping and cooking and washing, and they will learn all of those skills for living independently, as well as language and communication. So the provision at Morehouse School and College would be considered specialist, or in some models you get different tiers of intervention, so it would be tier 3. So these are for children with particular needs in speech and language. So they've got severe language disorders, and the fees for the school are paid for by their local authority, and they come from different areas of the country. The interventions are individualised to each child, and there are a range of professionals who work with them. This includes direct intervention from a speech and language therapist. In terms of research that we've carried out research at a range of levels. So first we've looked at the broad picture. Is the whole provision effective? And we've looked at that by looking at their progress on standardised tests of language and literacy and numeracy. We also look at their destinations. So last year, all of our students went on to further education or employment in the area that they had been training in at the college. So we're very pleased that they are continuing their education or going into the world of work. We've also then looked at our speech and language therapy provision in a broad way, looking at the progress of all students on the targets they were working on, regardless of what those targets are. Then we've looked at more detailed analyses about whether specific methods are effective. So, and I'm going to present these to you today. So we've looked at vocabulary, word finding, idioms, and grammar, both receptive and expressive. And all of this work provides very much needed evidence with adolescents. There's very little evidence about the effectiveness of intervention for older children with language disorders. So the provision at the school is quite different from the provision at the college. So at the school, which is aged 7 to 16, they have a mainstream curriculum, so their lessons cover the same topics as in the mainstream schools, but the content is changed to help them to access it despite their language disorders. They're in small classes with a maximum of 12 children per class. Each class has a teacher, a speech and language therapist, a teaching assistant, and also has an occupational therapist assigned to each class. But the occupational therapist will have more than one class to work with. The speech and language therapists each have just one class, so it's a very close team who know the children very well. The planning and working in English lessons is done jointly, so there's 1 hour a week of planning time for the team to plan together all the English lessons and other lessons across the week. So some other subjects, often science and maths, often have some joint teaching and collaborative planning as well, but all of the English lessons do. All students get direct work with the speech and language therapist, individual, one-to-one, maybe in pairs and also in groups for different areas. Then some students, depending on their needs, might get occupational therapy, OT, one-to-one or in pairs or groups. Some may have a literacy tutor if they're having literacy difficulties, and some see a psychotherapist. At the college, so these are now the 16 to 19-year-olds, the curriculum is taught both at the college but also at partner colleges. These are mainstream colleges which run vocational courses. So the students are learning about car mechanics or building or floristry or animal care, hair and beauty. They're learning about subjects that they can get a job in and have a career in. They're then supported by our staff who go with them to the college to help them access these mainstream courses, which hopefully will lead to jobs, but help with their language. Then back at Morehouse College, they will have extra English and maths. They learn functional skills, so how to do practical tasks. They're supported in their study, and they also have additional sessions to help their social skills and their life and independence skills. All students will have direct work with a speech and language therapist, and again, some, depending on their needs, will have work with an occupational therapist, literacy tutor or psychotherapist. So what's the profile of the children? So this is at age 11, which is when they start the secondary aspect of the school. So between 7 and 11, we just have one class. There's not so much demand for our specialist school at this age because there's quite good provision locally. But from 11 years, there's not very good provision for children with severe language disorders, so most of them will come to us at age 11. So at age 11, this is their profile. So 100 would be average, so they're all below average. This 85 and above would be the normal range. So you can see they're below the normal range on everything. This is receptive language, so particularly poor at receptive and expressive language. This is vocabulary, so less of a problem with vocabulary, reading and spelling on average, but you can see there's a wide range. So some children are in the normal range for literacy and vocabulary, but none are for language. Numeracy, so for maths work, this is also an area they have significant needs when they come into the school, related to their difficulties accessing the maths curriculum because of their language difficulties. So, what kind of progress do they make on these tests? So, we carry out these tests at age 11 and also at age 14 and age 16 so that we can see what progress they make over time. This is a study just representing a group of students. So these are all 57 students who attended the school from age 11 to 16 continuously. Some children come in later and some leave earlier. So this is just the children who were in the school from 11 to 16, who started their secondary schooling between 2005 and 2009 and finished the school at age 16 between 2011 and 2016. And this is how their scores change. So this is receptive language. You can see some progress here. This is expressive language, and this is vocabulary. When you look at whether this is significant, though, the receptive language, although it's gone up, actually there's no significant difference. This is in standard scores. In expressive language, there is a significant increase in the first 3 years and less so in the later years. Vocabulary, however, the standard scores, so relative to the typically developing population, are actually decreasing. So the gap is getting bigger. This doesn't mean their knowledge of vocabulary is getting worse, though. If we look at their actual raw scores, so this is the number of words they understand, we can see that this is increasing significantly over the years. The problem is that typically developing teenagers learn vocabulary very fast. So for children with language disorders to keep up with typically developing teenagers, or even to catch up, is extremely difficult with vocabulary. So they are making progress with vocabulary, but they're still falling further and further behind typically developing peers, because learning vocabulary is something they find particularly difficult, and typically developing children find particularly easy. In terms of literacy and numeracy, their reading improves, their spelling improves, and numeracy too. This is significant in the first period for reading and spelling, but not the later period. And for numeracy, it's the same pattern. So it seems the first 3 years of secondary schooling is more effective than the last 2 years, but I think this is partly a change in focus. So the first 3 years, the focus is very much on the children's individual skills, improving their language, improving their literacy and their numeracy. In the next 2 years, between 14 and 16, the major focus is on them accessing qualifications. So they don't get so much work on their actual individual needs. It's more on, can they get GCSEs, which is our national qualification that all children get at 16. So the focus is on, can they get a qualification in English, maths, science, and a range of other subjects. So it's much more focused on the academic curriculum and on supporting learning in those subjects rather than on their impairment. So I think maybe it's less surprising that their impairment-based scores don't improve as much. However, if your standard score stays the same, it means that you are improving at the same rate as typically developing children. So they are still making progress, they're just not catching up. So, for this we conclude that when we're working collaboratively, so the whole provision, which involves working collaboratively with a mainstream curriculum, but differentiated for language and individualised intervention as well, can lead to gains on standard scores, on standardised tests of language, literacy and numeracy. So their profile is actually now less impaired relative to typically developing peers. And vocabulary is an area of particular difficulty, but this is not just a finding we've found. So there's a study by Rice and Hoffman in the States showing that the gap gets bigger for vocabulary as well. So it seems to be the finding everywhere for for these children that they fall further and further behind with vocabulary learning. Okay, so we've started at the broadest, looking at the whole provision of the whole school. Now we're going to look just at the speech and language therapy provision. So just at this bit, this has just been published this August. So in this study, we evaluated the effectiveness of all of our one-to-one individual speech and language therapy intervention during one term. So all the children who were in the school at the time, aged 7 to 16, there were 72 children were involved in the study. Their mean age was 13. 88% had receptive language difficulties. 28% also had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and only 28% were girls. So these don't add up because, of course, some children are girls with ASD or have receptive language difficulties and are girls. So and all of the speech and language therapists in the school were involved, so it's looking at our overall provision. So the design was that we compared the progress on areas that were targeted for each child during the spring term with progress on control measures. So every child, their speech and language therapist will have at least one target that they're working on that term, usually 2, sometimes more. And there will be an individual target which has been tested before and will be tested again at the end of the term. This particular term, we said in addition to doing that, everybody needs to have a control area. So you measure them on the thing that you are working on and you measure them on something else, and you only give intervention on the target, not on the control. Then we measure both again and we see if the progress on the target is greater than the progress on the control. So everything was measured in percentages, which was tricky sometimes. So, for example, for vocabulary, it was easy. You could test them on 10 words and see they got 3 out of 10, so that's 30%. That's easy. What about when we're talking about how appropriately they start or finish a conversation? Well, for that, what we had to do was we had the therapist ask the teacher to rate the child's appropriacy of their starting a conversation. So on a scale of 0 to 5, how appropriately does the child start a conversation with you? And then the control measure was how appropriately does the child finish a conversation with you? And the intervention was just on starting a conversation, so we could see what the difference was. And we could turn that 0 to 5 into percentages, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100%. So some measures were more precise than others, but we wanted to be able to combine all of this information. All of the post-therapy assessments at the end of the term were blind. And for this, for a week, all of the therapists swapped caseloads. So everybody was put into pairs. And if I'm paired with you, then you give me all the tests for your children, and I test them. And I don't know which things you worked on and which things you didn't work on. I give you all my tests, and you test my children. So within our team, we could swap everybody so that we could actually do blind testing to see what the progress was on the targets and the controls. The pre-therapy assessment done at the beginning of term was actually done by the therapist who was going to deliver the intervention. So if there was any bias towards working better for the therapist that you know well, or the therapist giving you extra points because they like you or something, then the chances were that any bias would be give higher scores pre-therapy, because that was the person they knew. At the end, it was somebody they didn't know who didn't know what they'd been working on. So if there was any bias, you'd expect higher scores at the beginning and lower scores at the end. Ideally, everything would have been blind, but it just wasn't possible to manage in a school with 72 students when all the testing had to be done in 1 week. So the overall results, so these are the targets over here and the controls here. So before we started, at the beginning of term, the average score was around 40% on the target, whatever the target was, and the controls were very similar. So, and they didn't differ significantly before we started. After the intervention, you can see that both the targets and the controls have improved, but the progress on the targets is much bigger than the progress on the controls. We don't know whether the controls improved because it was just a practice effect, they did the test twice, or whether there was generalization from the target to the control. We can't actually tell anything about that. Or maybe just because the children are a bit older and they've been in school. But the key thing is that the progress on the targets was greater. So the additional help that they got on the targets was making a difference. So, and that was significant. The actual change scores between the targets and the controls was significant. So the progress was significantly greater on the targets than the controls. The amount of intervention per target on average was 4 hours, so 4.2 hours. So this wasn't a huge amount of intervention. It's an amount that might be possible in other settings. This graph shows change scores. So anything above 0 is positive change. So their scores were higher after the therapy than before. This is the targets. These are the controls. And these are the different areas of language. So we've got receptive language, expressive language, academic skills. So this was things like writing an essay for your English exam with a good structure, or including more adjectives in your writing, for example. This was social skills or pragmatics. Weren't many of those because that's mostly targeted in groups. And this was literacy. Not many of those because we have a separate literacy tutor. So these were mainly phonological awareness. But there was no interaction or effect of the difference between different target areas. So there was significant difference between progress on targets and controls on all areas. So it looks like, including receptive language, we could make significant progress. So the targets improved more than the controls in all areas. We then looked at different aspects of the children to see what predicted who made the most progress. And we found no effect on their response to intervention, and by that we meant their progress on the targets minus the progress on controls. So we've got the extra bit of progress that they made. And that was no difference between girls and boys, even though the girls generally had lower scores. No difference between those who had receptive language difficulties and those who didn't, as measured on the KELF. And no difference as to whether or not you also had a diagnosis of ASD, of autism spectrum disorder. So we concluded that our one-to-one SLT provision, which covered a wide range of targets over the mean of 4.5 hours intervention, was effective for these older children with language disorders, irrespective of the target area, their receptive language status, their ASD status, or their gender. So we conclude that people should be offering services to older children because these children aged 7 to 16 were making good progress with individualised intervention. A lot of services in the UK don't see children after the age of 11 because they don't believe they can make any more progress. So we are saying they can make good progress, both on standardised tests but also on specific measures like this. Okay, now to get to the specific areas. So first we're going to look at vocabulary. So the first is a paper that's just been accepted. It's not yet online, but hopefully will be within the next month. And the second is a poster that was presented at the recent Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy conference in September. So the first study was part of the study I've just mentioned before. So many of the receptive language targets were actually on vocabulary. And so we looked in a lot more detail at vocabulary, and Lisa Wright wrote this up as part of her Masters. So she was one of our staff, and she carried out this particular part of the intervention as part of a Masters. So this was 25 of the participants, and they were aged 9 to 16. The intervention was one-to-one with their own speech and language therapist. And it focused on semantics and phonology of words and also the ability to use them in sentences. And again, she compared progress on targeted versus non-targeted vocabulary. as part of the project I've just spoken about. So there were 25 participants. They were split into two groups because some of them had better vocabulary before they started than others. And this individual speech and language therapist decided for each child whether they should go in the lower level group or the higher level group. Because we didn't want children who had good or better vocabulary to be learning words they already knew, but we didn't want children who had very poor vocabulary to be learning words that were too hard for them. So they were split into two groups. Then, within each group, the words were randomly assigned to different participants. So 8 participants were assigned set A for intervention, which was 10 nouns and 10 verbs, and set B had no intervention. The other 8 participants had intervention on set B, but not set A. So we split the words into set A and set B, but some children had intervention on one set and some on the other, and the opposite ones were the controls. And then the same happened for the higher level group. So we got set D and set C. This group had intervention on set C, and this group had intervention on set D. So just looking at the results of this, looking at the nouns, so for each child they had a target versus a control. So I've combined set A and B, but we've renamed them to words that were targeted and words that were not targeted for each child. So this is their performance on nouns before we started. This is their performance on verbs. The nouns were better than the verbs at the beginning of the intervention and at the end. Oops. And then this is after the intervention for both the nouns and the verbs. And you can see that there's significant progress on the targets, both nouns and verbs, and there is some progress on the controls. But, as before, the targets improve more than the controls. So this graph is, to simplify it, I've just got the change score now. So this is the change in the targeted nouns in percentage correct. The change in the targeted verbs you can see was control nouns you can see was smaller. And then for verbs, also more progress on the targets, but the controls made some progress too on the verbs. So actually, for both nouns and verbs, there was more progress on the targets than the controls. But it looks as if there actually might have been greater generalisation for the verbs. We can't tell that for definite because we didn't have a control group of children who didn't do the intervention at all, but just did the test twice. That's what you would need to see if there's actually generalisation as opposed to a practice effect or getting older. So we'd like to investigate that further in the future. And the amount of therapy for this was an average of 3¼ hours. We followed this up by doing a similar study with the college students. So these are the age 16 to 19-year-olds. So this is a study that's only just been analysed and was presented at the Royal College Conference. So this had 28 participants aged 16 to 19 and a half. The intervention was one-to-one with their own SLT, 30 minutes a week for 10 weeks. And again, this focused on both the semantics of the meaning of the words, the phonology, the sounds of the words, and also identifying what part of speech. And this one looked at nouns, verbs, and adjectives, and also how to use them in sentences. And compared progress on 20 targeted words versus 20 control words used in their current college course. So every student now had different words from each other. So those who were doing a painting and decorating course had words to do with painting and decorating, 20 that were taught and 20 that weren't, and those who were doing courses on flower arranging had the names of lots of different flowers and different arrangement techniques, which I know very little about. So every student had different words from each other, but each student had 20 that were targeted in therapy and 20 that weren't. So you've got 40 words randomly assigned to 2 different groups. All of these words were used in their course, though, at college. So they would have heard all 40 words during the teaching in their college on their specialist course. but only 20 of them had additional teaching from the speech and language therapist. So the intervention included explicit teaching of 2 new words per week. They had to write and say the word, draw a picture, write a definition, use different clues to work out what word class it is it a noun, verb, adjective? They colour-coded it using the shape coding colours that we'll talk about later. Then put the words into a sentence, and then had semantic links using a word map where you would have the word in the middle and all the different meanings that the word can have and how it links to other words. And then looked at the phonological properties as well, so what's the sound structure of this word. The overall results, pre-therapy, no difference between the 2 groups, but after intervention, a huge difference in the comprehension of the words that they had in therapy. And again, no, the progress on the control words was still significant. And maybe this is a result of the teaching in the college or maybe on their specialist course, or maybe this is a practice effect. Who knows? But the important thing is that there was more progress on the targets than the controls again. And that was a very large effect. And we're actually replicating this study this year in a more tightly controlled way with all of the students in the college age 16 to 19 again. So watch this space. They're currently at about week 8 of the intervention. So, and we've got 4 therapists who are involved in planning that and delivering that as well. Okay, now a bit on word finding. So again, we've got 2 papers. We've got one that's already published and then another one in the college, which has just recently been presented at the RCSLT conference. So the original study was a randomized control trial where we had 15 participants aged 9 to 16, randomly assigned to 2 groups. One group had word finding therapy, which was focused on the semantic properties of words, one-to-one with their SLT. The other group had therapy on something else, anything else. It didn't matter what, as long as it was nothing to do with word finding. And then in phase 2, that group then also received the word finding therapy. So they acted as a weighting control group. So the semantic therapy, it consisted of 2 15-minute sessions a week for 8 weeks, so 4 hours in total. One-to-one with their own speech and language therapist. The activities they did were sorting photo cards into different categories. So you might have the category animals and you're sorting them into categories and the child would choose how to sort them. So this was different for each child. So one child, for example, sorted the animals into scary animals versus not scary animals or friendly animals. And that's okay because they can sort it how they choose, but hopefully that will increase their ability to access the words if they've got them stored in semantic groups. And then they had to break them down into narrower categories. They discussed the attributes of pictures in terms of their meaning, comparing different pictures. Then we had 20 questions, which is where you give clues to the other person. They have to guess which animal you've got. And you have to give as few clues as possible. So you're practicing accessing the most important features of that word. And then when it comes to word production, if you've practiced accessing those semantic features, it should help you to access the word for production. Then we had a dice game where on the dice it had the 6 sides had different things on them, like say where you would find this animal, what does it eat, where does it live, how many legs has it got, what group is it, etc. So it had different things to think about. So you had to pick up a picture and then give that clue for that picture. We tested them on the test of adolescent word finding. So this is a standardized test. So in the first phase, the therapy group have had intervention, and this is their change score. So anything above 0 shows progress. So you can see they made good progress. This is the weighting control group who haven't yet had intervention. Again, you can see a little bit of progress, but not as much. So after phase 1, the therapy group have made significantly more progress than the controls. Then in phase 2, the weighting controls then get the intervention, And they now also have made good progress. And the original group now are not having intervention, but we can see that their scores are very similar. So they've maintained the progress that they'd made in the first place. So after phase 2, both groups have made equal progress. So it's not that these weighting controls can't make progress. They didn't make progress without intervention, but then when they received the intervention, they made the same progress as the original group. And the progress was maintained by the original group. So we concluded that 4 hours of therapy focused on semantics can improve word finding on a standardized test. I haven't shown you this data, but we didn't find any significant predictors of who would make the most progress, including their ability at word finding at the beginning, or their other language scores. The test of adolescent word finding lets you categorize children into fast namers and slow namers. That didn't make any difference in who made the most progress. But we did find, we looked at discourse, so the ability to describe a picture and reduce the number of word finding errors in those while describing a picture, and it didn't generalize. So maybe once they've made the progress with this kind of intervention, we actually need additional intervention to get that progress to carry over into discourse and conversation. But the progress on the standardized test was maintained for 5 months. This is a follow-up study, again with the post-16, so the 16 to 19-year-olds, because there's no evidence anywhere about whether you can make progress with 16 to 19-year-olds. So we're very keen to find some evidence for this. So we're replicating a lot of the studies we've previously done, but with this older group. So we did exactly the same intervention as the previous study, 1-to-1 with the speech and language therapist. This time, though, 2 times 15 minutes a week was difficult to timetable, so we did 130 minutes a week for 8 weeks. So it was the same amount, but 130 instead of 2 15 minutes. These were 16 to 18-year-olds. Their mean score, standard score on the test of adolescent word finding was 67, and they were all below 85, so they were all below the normal range. So this time we didn't have a weighting control group. They all acted like the weighting control group. So the first term, they had intervention on something else. They were tested on word finding here, then they had some other intervention, then they were tested again. So we can see the progress with no word finding intervention. Then they had word finding intervention with their SLT and were tested a 3rd time. So this is looking at their change scores. So we see a tiny bit of change during the term where they had no word finding intervention, and a much bigger change during the term when they did. So again, there was significant progress without intervention, which could be practice effect, and there was progress with intervention, but the progress with intervention was significantly greater than the progress during the baseline. And again, it was 4 hours of intervention. And actually, when we looked at the individual participants, 9 of them now had standard scores above 85 on the test of adolescent word finding, so they're now within the normal range. So the pattern of results for these children was very similar to the weighting controls in the first study. So it seems that this kind of word finding intervention can be effective even for students over the age of 16. Okay. This next project is an ongoing project with Lucy Benjamin, who's now one of our staff, who's also doing a part-time PhD. So this is looking at idioms, and she presented a paper at the RCSLT conference as well. So idioms are non-literal language. So in English, he pulled it off means he succeeded. So if I pull off this presentation, it means it's gone okay, I've done a good job, I've succeeded. Whereas literally would mean to pull something off something. And a lot of the children in the school understand these idioms literally. So she's wanting to look at improving their understanding of non-literal language. So she's got 53 participants within the school, aged between 9 and 16. This time, there were 2 different interventions. One was 1-to-1 with their SLT, and the other intervention was in English lessons, which was jointly delivered by the teacher and the SLT together in the context of the books that they were reading in class. So with each one, though, they had 30 minutes a week for 10 weeks. And they also had a PowerPoint display for each idiom, explaining what it means with pictures and different scenarios where this idiom might be used. And then they had a worksheet to fill out, and there was also a poster that would be put on the wall, either in the classroom, if they were in the classroom group, or on the wall in the speech and language therapist room, if they weren't. And she compared progress on on several idioms, and they were split into 3 groups. So there's one group of idioms that were targeted in the one-to-one sessions, another group of idioms that were targeted in the class sessions, and a third group of idioms that were not targeted at all. So they were the control group. So it was a very complicated design. The 53 participants were split into these 2 groups. That doesn't add up. Sorry, excuse my maths. I think some got lost along the way. So we've got Group A and Group B, 3 sets of 16 idioms. During the baseline period, which was actually the school summer holidays, nobody had any intervention. So they were tested in July, and then they had the school holidays and they were tested again in September. So we can see what just happens over 10 weeks of no intervention. What kind of progress do they make? Then in term 1, one group had individual SLT on 16 idioms. The other group had classroom intervention on a different 16 idioms. The second term, they swapped over. So this group then had classroom intervention on these 16 idioms, while the other group had one-to-one intervention on those 16. And then the final term, they had intervention on something else, not to do with idioms. So that's testing whether they maintained any progress. So we're just going to look at this group first and see what happened to them. So this group, these are the control idioms, which got gradually better all the time. And during the baseline, where there's no intervention, this is the summer holidays, you can see everything improved a very similar amount. So maybe this is a bit of a practice effect. And the rate of progress on the control idioms was very similar throughout. So this probably is just some kind of practice effect. The targeted idioms, though, these ones were the ones that were targeted in class, and they had classroom intervention in the first term. And you can see the progress on those during the term when they had the intervention on those idioms was much steeper. And then these idioms were targeted one-to-one in this term. So you can see that most of the progress was made during the term when they had the intervention on those idioms. And progress was maintained, so it didn't drop back down again. This group had a slightly less clear pattern. So during the baseline here, actually, they got pretty stable, even slightly worse. So no obvious practice effect here during the baseline, during the summer holidays. Then, these idioms were targeted one-to-one in the first term and showed excellent, significant progress. During that term, however, these idioms, which were not targeted, also improved significantly. So maybe this is generalization because this was much bigger progress than during the baseline. So this is more progress than you would expect based on what happened here. And then these ones were then targeted in the classroom, and these ones still weren't. And you can see that there's continued progress on those ones. So the classroom intervention then did add something on top of that. And again, you can see that the progress was maintained here as well. So she's concluded that it is possible to develop idiom skills in these 19 to 16-year-old children with developmental language disorder, both through one-to-one and classroom intervention. It may be that there's some generalization from the one-to-one intervention. We can't say that for certain because the idioms were different in the 2 groups, so it may be something to do with the idioms that were targeted and that were not targeted, but it looks as if there may have been some generalisation there. And hopefully this should assist their access to the literature that they're having to do in English lessons. There are a lot of idioms. Lucy's also, as part of her PhD, looked at standard texts that are used in English lessons. I don't know how many books she's read, and she's counted the number of idioms in every book. So she's shown that the number of idioms increases as you get older. She's also listened to lots of popular media for children of those ages. So she's found out what websites they like, what television programs they like watching, and she's watched hours of those and counted all of the idioms as well, and found that that increases over time. And she also sat in classrooms and listened to the teachers and counted how many idioms the teachers use. And again, the older children heard a lot more idioms than the younger children, so they need to be able to access these and understand them. And hopefully this intervention should help with this. Okay, the final section, looking at grammar. So for this, this is looking at the shape coding intervention that Jorent's mentioned. So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to what shape coding is first, before I go on to telling you about a couple of the studies. So shape coding is for teaching sentence structure to children, and it's got three main aspects. So parts of speech for individual words are colour-coded. So nouns are red, verbs are blue, prepositions are yellow, adjectives are green, for example. So these are for individual words. Then, when we've got sentences, we want to group the words according to their meaning and their function in the sentence. And we have shapes for those. And the advantage of these shapes is that you can put shapes inside other shapes and show how language builds up in a hierarchy. And you can move them around. So for asking questions in English, you move the verb to the beginning of the sentence. So you can pick up the verb shape and move it to the beginning of the sentence. Then there's a system of arrows for helping show verb morphology, so they're mostly for tense. And then we have single and double lines for singular and plural. So these are the shapes. So the phrase is a group of shapes and linked with a colour and a question and a symbol. So we've got this shape, the hexagon, with 6 sides for the verb phrase. So that tells you what someone's doing. And it's got a blue line in it, which is the colour for a verb. But it may well have more than just a verb in it. It has to have a verb, but it may have other words in as well. Then we've got the adjective phrase, which tells you what something's like or how somebody feels, and it has an adjective in it, a green word. Then we've got the shape for telling you where something is, which is a prepositional phrase, which has a yellow word or a preposition in it. Then we've got 2 different shapes for who and what, according to the role they play in the sentence, not according to whether they are humans or objects. So we've got the one who's doing the action is in the oval, and the one having the action done to them is in the rectangle. So if you have the girl hit the boy, the girl is doing the action and the boy is the one getting hit. So the girl is in the oval and the boy is in the rectangle. You could have the car hit the boy, and even though the car is not animate, it's still doing the hitting. You could have the car hit the wall. So it's helping to show them who does what to whom. And quite a few of the children have problems with this. Maybe not at the basic level of the girl hit the boy, but as soon as you start making things more complicated, like the boy was hit by the girl, then they have a lot of problems. And by using the same consistent shapes, we can show them what the meanings of these sentences are. We also have some extra shapes to help them. So one for how, that we call the flag, and one for when, which we call the triangle. Then there's a shape for auxiliaries, modals, and copulars, and also one for answering why questions. So these are the basic shapes which they will gradually learn. And then we have some basic sentence templates which aim to cover most of the grammar of English. If you're translating it to a different language, you may need to change this I've had a go for Norwegian. I'm sorry I didn't do it for Spanish. Anyway, these are the basic patterns for English. So this one would be the who and the what they're like. So we could put in John is happy. Then we've got who and what doing. John laughed. Or present tense, got John is shaving. This tells us where someone is. So John is behind Sarah. And here we can see we've got one word per shape. The reason for having the colours and the shapes is because we don't want to just have one word per shape. We want to get the children to be able to produce longer sentences than just these. At the very basic level, this would be fine, but the children I'm working with are older. They need to be getting more advanced sentence structure. So there are different ways we can make our sentences more complicated. We can add pink words and red words to our ovals and rectangles. So now, instead of John is happy, we've got a tall boy is happy. Who laughed? 2 naughty boys. Who's shaving? The silly boy. Who's behind his big sister? My funny friend. Who's my funny friend behind? His big sister. So now we're making our sentences more complex by teaching them rules that you can put these extra colours inside these shapes. We can take out all of the colours and all the inside shapes if we want to make it look simpler. This is now back to the same basic sentence structure. So it's the same pattern as we had at the beginning, but now we've got several words in each shape. Another way to make our sentences longer is to add shapes to the beginning and ends of our sentences, so we can add where. So now we've got the tall boy's happy at his school, and I'm colouring the new information because I want to draw their attention to the new information. This they've already learnt, so we don't need all of the extra colours and shapes inside that because they know that bit. So I want to draw their attention to the where. Some naughty boys laughed in their classroom. Silly boy is shaving behind the bike shed. So you're adding extra information. Okay. We can add other information. We can add where. When. If we had space on my screen, I could also have all of the wheres as well. So now I've got the tall boy. This morning, the tall boy is happy at his school. That tells me when he's happy. Some naughty boys laughed on Monday. Sad boy is shaving right now. A few weeks ago, my funny friend was behind his sister, big sister. So you see our sentences are getting longer and more complex, but they've still got the same basic pattern, so we can build it up very gradually for the children. If we're getting on to looking at tense, we can also add time arrows to our when and tense arrows to our verbs. So we've got present time arrow in the middle links with present tense. Past time has to have past tense. So we've got always the time has to link with the tense. You can't say a few weeks ago my funny friend is behind his big sister because they don't match. So our tense and our time have to match. Another way of increasing complexity is to add and. So within the who, we've now got 2 ovals with an and in the middle. So who's happy? The boy and the girl. How do they feel? Not just happy, but happy and healthy. We can do this for the verb phrase as well. What did they do? Laughed and pointed. We can add 3 things. So a boy, his brother and his dad are shaving and washing. And if we want to make it simpler, we can get rid of all the inside shapes and we're back to the same basic pattern. Of course, we can add all the shapes to the ends and the beginnings as well. So again, we're expanding our sentences constantly. We can increase it even further. The idea is that you should be able to use this for any sentence of English or for another language if you've translated it. So we can add whole sentences into the shapes. So now, instead of the boy was happy or John is happy, we've got the who is the boy who was playing in the park yesterday was, how does he feel? Happier than he has ever been. So now we're getting really long, complex sentences. We could use this for production, but actually I find this more helpful for comprehension. So if they're reading a text like at school, which includes a sentence like this, and they're looking at it and saying, I don't understand anything, if we can put the shapes around to show that actually this huge, long sentence is basically about a boy who's happy. So So we can put the shapes around it, and then we can find the main red word and the main green word, which will be boy, happy, and that is actually the key information you need to take from that sentence. So you can use it for making comprehension much simpler and breaking it down for them. You can join whole sentences together using conjunctions. So some boys laughed and pointed, while other boys ran away. And of course, you can do a combination of the above. So I could have the boy who was playing in the park yesterday was happier than he has ever been because his mum bought him a really large ice cream. So we can cope with these kinds of sentences, which is the kind of sentences that you need if you're working with children up to age 19. So, is it effective? I'm only going to present 2 studies, and the 2 I've chosen are the better ones. So these are both randomised control trials, but very small scale. One on production of sentences and one on comprehension. So for production, we had 27 participants aged 11 to 16. They were split into 3 groups. There were 9 who had shape coding therapy, 9 who had a control therapy, which was inferencing, which was not predicted to improve the area we were looking at, and 9 who focused on the meanings of verbs. So this was looking at verb argument structure, which is knowing what comes after the verb, what kinds of sentence constituents need to come after the verb, and using those accurately. And that has 2 aspects. One is knowing a lot about the meaning of the verb, and the other is knowing what comes after it and in what order. So we were trying to pull those 2 things apart and see if it was more effective to learn about the meaning of the verb or more effective to learn about the sentence structure. So the intervention was 30 minutes a week for 9 weeks. This time I was the SLT for all of the children, whereas in the other studies that we've done more recently, it's a much wider range of SLTs, so it's much more looking at whether this can be used by a wider range of people. So in this study, it was just me, and the rest of their therapy and classroom practice continued as usual, but they weren't allowed to focus on this area. So the semantic therapy was looking in detail at the meanings of verbs. So for example, fill and pour. A lot of children were having difficulty with the verb fill. So filling, we would have to say in English, I'm filling the glass with orange juice. A lot of the children I work with would say, I'm filling orange juice into the glass, which is the same structure as pouring orange juice into the glass, which is fine for pouring, but not for filling. With filling, you're filling the glass. The focus is on the glass, the thing that is changing. So we looked at what fill and pour actually mean. And the crucial thing with fill is it means it has to end up full. And most of the children I was working with did not realise that filling means it has to be full. So if I put a small amount of water in the glass and said, is this filling? They'd say yes. If I put 2 crisps into a large packet, is that filling? Yes. So they thought it meant the same as pouring or putting, which it doesn't. So they hadn't got that focus. So we looked at the fact that it doesn't just mean putting something in it, it means, crucially, making something full to the top. With pouring, there are lots of different aspects as well. So it means that a liquid or lots of things have to move downwards together, end up in a new place, and you have to tip the container. So if you don't have any of those aspects, then it's no longer pouring. So if I pick up things and put them in, that's not pouring. I can pour water onto the floor out of a jug, but if I do it like this and the water comes out, that's not pouring because I'm not tipping the container. So we were looking very much at the details, and we would take turns to act something out. It was messy when we were pouring. We didn't pour water onto the floor, but we did pour pasta onto the floor and shake it. And so I would do an action that was not one of these, and they had to choose whether it matches the definition or not. The shape coding therapy, for this one, we didn't look at individual verbs, we looked at them in groups. So, and we matched the general broad meaning to the sentence structure. So, for example, you are pouring water into the glass. the key thing is that all verbs that fit this pattern, this thing is moving. So the thing in the rectangle that you mentioned second is moving. Whereas filling the glass with water, the glass is not moving, it's changing in some way. It's going from not full to full. So that's the difference between those two verbs. And we taught other verbs that fit the same pattern as well. And the results were, so after we've done the intervention, these two groups, the verb semantics and the shape coding group, have both had intervention. The third group of children have been having intervention on something else, not predicted to improve verb argument structure. And on average, they've gone down, but you can see there's quite a lot of change. And these two groups have improved. Both of the intervention groups improved significantly more than the controls. And actually, there wasn't any significant difference between the two groups. So the shape coding was slightly better, but it's not significantly better than the verb semantics. The next thing to do would be to combine the two. That's what I've now done in intervention since. I've combined both the semantics with the shape coding, but I haven't actually evaluated that in a proper study. So that needs doing. And you would assume that the effect would be bigger because we're adding both effects together, but who knows? Then we looked at whether they maintained the progress. So this was tested again a few months later. The controls have got even worse. So this is definitely not a practice effect. Maybe here they're thinking, I'm doing this same test again. I must have got it wrong last time. I'll try something different. So they actually got worse. And these groups have stayed pretty much the same. So their gains were better than zero, as in there's significant progress in both groups at both time points. So they've maintained that progress as well. So it looks like 4.5 hours of therapy can improve verb argument structure. Both methods were equally effective. I haven't shown you this, but progress did actually generalise to other verbs as well. So it's not just the few verbs that we taught, but the pattern seemed to generalise to other related verbs. But it didn't generalise to verb morphology, so it wasn't some general effect of learning, it was specific to verb argument structure. And progress was maintained for 3 months. Then the last study I'm going to show you is looking at comprehension of conjunctions. Again, this was a randomised control trial with a small scale, again, 14 participants. 7 of them in phase 1 had shape coding therapy, and 7 had some other therapy, anything they like, but not conjunctions and not shape coding. Then phase 2, we swapped over. So these are the waiting control group again, who then get it later. And they then had some other therapy, so we could see if they maintained their progress. This was, again, 30 minutes a week, this time with their own SLT, so not with me. I didn't provide any of this. 4 hours in total, and using shape coding as a visual support. And we were looking at the coordinating conjunctions of and, but not. So the cow, but not the horse is jumping. Neither nor, so neither the cow nor the horse is jumping, which means the cow and the horse are not jumping. And then this is a particularly tricky one. Not only the cow, but also the horse is jumping, which actually means they're both jumping. And a lot of the children were having difficulty comprehending these. So we devised a sequence of steps to work through, and we instructed the speech and language therapist to work at the child's own pace and to move on when they felt the child was ready. So they stopped after 8 sessions, and some children had finished the end of the programme and some had only got halfway through. But we didn't want them to move faster than they were ready for. We didn't want them to move on to the next conjunction when they hadn't understood the previous one. So it involved the SLTs making clinical judgments as to when to move on. So we did this looking at coordinating phrases. So things like the ball is red and blue. So maybe it's stripy or spotty. Also in the verb phrase. So the cow is not only jumping, but also running. And that means the same as and. The cow, but not the dog, is jumping. Now we've got a cross under the not to show it's not this one. So they had to learn that this one does the jumping and this one does not do the jumping. A lot of them were making them both jump. And then this one, not this one, neither the cow nor the dog, so not the cow and not the dog is jumping. they're doing something else. And we had 2 tests. Well, in the therapy, we had toy small animals that they acted out. So they would put the animals on the shapes. So they'd put the cow and the dog on the shapes and work out in the bottom one that this one's not jumping and this one's not jumping, and then actually act something out. Or the cow but not the dog is jumping. They put the cow and the dog on the shapes. Right, this one, the cow is jumping, make it jump, and the dog is not jumping, maybe make it go to sleep. So it was very practical, and actually people worry that these older children don't want to play with little toys. The focus isn't on the playing, the focus is on the language and actually getting them to physically put objects on the shapes and then work out what it means and act it out. They don't mind at all, they're quite happy as long as the focus is actually on the language and they're using this as a tool. So these 16-year-olds don't mind having little toy cows and dogs and making them jump, and actually they think it's quite fun. And also you can do it with real people as well. So we've had, we take turns to make sentences, so you might have the therapist makes a sentence and the child acts it out, or the child does one and the therapist acts it out. So maybe the child, if I was doing the session, they might say, Mrs. Ebbels is standing on one leg but not hopping, so then I'd be standing on one leg. And so you can actually do practical things with the actual people in the room, which can be quite fun. We've just done a project on using subordinating conjunctions, which did help with some of the therapy. And one of the children discovered I get very dizzy, so he would give me instructions like, Mrs. Ebbels is turning, no, you turn round and round until I clap, and then he doesn't clap, and I'm left going round and round and round. So lots of practical activities which make language fun, and it shows the power of language. Anyway, on to the results. So looking at the change scores again. So after phase 1, they've had the intervention and they haven't. Again, they've got worse. So with the grammar ones, we usually tend to find our controls seem to get worse with practice. Whereas on all the other aspects, they got a bit better. So I'm not sure what's happening there. Then, so you can see they made significantly more progress than them. Then the weighting controls then get the intervention, and they also make progress. In fact, they made even more progress. And this group maintained their progress. So they've both made equal progress. There wasn't significantly different progress. And for both groups, that was significant progress. And it was maintained by the original group. You can see that effect didn't go away. So for that, we concluded 4 hours of therapy improved their comprehension of these conjunctions. I didn't show you this, but it also led to significant change on the standardised test, the TROG, the test of reception of grammar. We looked at who made the most progress, and we couldn't find any predictors. It didn't matter what their pre-therapy language scores were. Surprisingly, it didn't matter what their non-verbal IQ was. Or more surprising, it didn't matter what their visual perceptual skills were like, and it didn't matter what their age was. So, and this is partly because one of the girls had quite low non-verbal IQ and quite poor visual perceptual skills, but she made the second most amount of progress. So she really showed us that actually maybe you don't need to have really good visual skills and good IQ to actually learn from this. In fact, several people have told me this approach is quite effective with children with Down syndrome who do not have high IQs. There aren't any research studies, but anecdotal evidence is that it seems to be quite effective for them. And progress was maintained for 4 months. So conclusions about shape coding. Looks like it can be effective for children aged 8 to 16. There are a couple of studies done by other people down to 6 years, actually. One that's impressed now that's just been done in a language unit in Australia. So actually we could revise that to 6 to 16. Including those who have severe receptive language difficulties, and these are the group that have the most difficulty showing any progress with intervention. And my clinical experience is that this group of children actually seem to like shape coding better than the less severe children, and they seem to make more progress. So it almost works best with the children where nothing else works, which is great, because there are other things that will work for the less impaired children. can help improve the production of verb argument structure, comprehension of coordinating conjunctions, which I've shown you. There are also smaller studies looking at comprehension of passives and questions, datives, spoken and written past tense. I haven't got time to show you those today. We haven't yet found any obvious predictors of who benefits the most, and we've just recently developed an app, but we don't know whether the app itself is effective, but on iPad and Android. To conclude, overall, looks like direct speech and language therapy intervention can be effective for children and adolescents aged 8 to 19 or 7 to 19 with severe language disorders, including receptive language difficulties, including if they've got co-occurring ASD or hearing impairment. And the collaborative model of provision with individualised intervention for specific needs seems to lead to progress on standardised tests as well. So I don't think we should assume that older children with language disorders cannot make progress, because we now have quite a lot of evidence that they can. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Time for questions, preguntas, comentarios, quejas.
They don't have to ask in English, do they?
No,
Do they know? Do they know? I don't think the questions have to be in English. I think it can be, they'll be translated, yeah?
Buenos días, gracias. No sé si me lo perdí o quisiera saber a ver. Lo que quisiera saber es cuán estandarizada está la prueba en inglés. Sí. Ah, vale. No, igual es.
Ajá.
Perdón, lo que quiero saber es la metodología, el shape coding, si está estandarizado en inglés ya y si se utiliza en otras instituciones, aparte de esta escuela especial en la que usted trabaja.
I don't think I've got channel 6, but I did hear. Anyway, I think I understood. I think you said, was it used in other institutions? Is that right? Okay. Yes, it is used in other settings, particularly in England and Ireland and Australia. It's used quite a lot usually in specialist settings, but there are people using it in mainstream schools as well. In fact, Ireland seems to be the people who are the most keen. So yeah. No. Well, so different in the papers I've written the series of steps to go through, so for those individual areas that are published in papers. But in other aspects of the shape coding have not been written out in quite such a way. There is a CD of resources that people can buy with lots of worksheets, and the main way that people learn about it is through me running courses. So I do a basic level shape coding course, which is a one-day course, and then a part 2 course. So most people are actually learning through the courses. And it's not really meant to be a program that you work through, that you start at the beginning and then you do this, this, this. It's more a tool for therapists to use. So once you understand the system, You can use it in whatever way you like to help teach the things that the children need to learn. So, does that answer your question? Yes, it's meant to be very flexible. But that does mean it's not appropriate to give to somebody who's had no training. So it's not appropriate to give to a classroom assistant and say, do this for the next 6 weeks, because they won't know what to do. So it hasn't been designed in that way. It's a tool to use in the way that is most useful to you. Okay.
Hello, Susan. If I want to have training in shape coding, what I have to do? Must I go to England to...
At the moment, you must come to England or you must ask me to come here. But I am planning to run an online course. The plan is to develop that this year, but I'm at the very beginning of that process. I had a good chat to Alfonso about this last night, about actually how to do this. So this is in the plan, but I haven't done it yet. So using an idiom, don't hold your breath. So, but yeah.
The shape coding, could it be used to teach an additional language? For example, here in Spain, well, in Catalonia we are bilingual because we have Spanish and Catalan. So do you think it could be used to teach also the second language, or would that confuse the children?
I think it could be used. Sorry, I think it could be used. People have asked me about doing that and have tried it. So somebody has asked me, can I use it to teach Chinese learners of English about English grammar? They haven't told me how it went though. So I know people have tried it, but I haven't heard whether it was successful or not. So, but it could be useful for showing grammatical differences between languages. So you could code the way that the grammar works in one language and code the way it works in another language and say this is the difference between them. You might have to do that with older children, or maybe you could use it just to teach the one language. So I think that's a possibility, but we don't know how successful that's likely to be. So if you try it, please do tell me if it works, because then when people ask, I can actually give an answer. So.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's one at the back.
Sí. En relación a la primera parte de la exposición, cuando habló de social skills y pragmatics, si puede comentar en su experiencia en esta escuela específica para niños y adolescentes con problemas específicos de lenguaje, su experiencia en la terapia grupal, si está relacionada con las habilidades pragmáticas.
I didn't get let me change this. Channel 6, I've got it now. Sorry. Can we translate that?
¿Otra vez?
Yes, I got bits of it, but not the whole lot.
Bueno, no sé, ¿puedo decirlo?
Yes, I can hear you now, yes.
¿Sí? Vale.
Okay,
As you
thank
wish. No, pero es que me da corte. Pues esto, si puede explicar brevemente su experiencia en las terapias grupales con niños con trastorno específico del lenguaje, y si hacéis hincapié, énfasis en lo que es el área pragmática y de habilidades sociales, sobre todo con adolescentes. Me interesa mucho conocer su opinión. Gracias.
Yeah. Yes, we do teach social skills and pragmatics in groups. I'm not sure how effective it is, though. We are doing a study this year as well with the children in the college, the 16 to 19-year-olds, where we are looking at whether it improves social skills and also life skills and knowledge of the world. So hopefully we will have some information soon. Yeah, I think with what we've done in the school, we haven't done a proper study yet, and maybe we should, because it's an area that I think is very difficult, and I'm not convinced that what we're doing is as effective as some of the other things that we're doing. So, yeah.
Good morning. Well, you told us about working in a special school, and you said also that they tried in normal schools, but you're talking about very reduced groups of pupils, and the problem that we have in Spain normally is that we have 25, 30 pupils in a class. So do you think that we can do it with all these pupils in a class, or we should separate them and try to work with them separately?
I think it might depend on the children. So I think you can, you could use this kind of system to teach grammar to all children. In fact, some people are wondering if that might help, because in English schools they're learning a lot more formal grammar in mainstream schools now, which they didn't do before. So they are learning about nouns and verbs and how to put sentences together. I'm not sure how much they actually need that in mainstream schools, but you could use it for all children, just to teach linguistics. But what would be helpful is if the children with the language difficulties know the basics of the system, which maybe might have to be taught separately, then the teachers could back that up. So if the teachers are teaching a new word in the science lesson, for example, and they write the word on the board, instead of just writing the word, if it's a noun, they could underline it in red and maybe put a circle around it. Now, the rest of the class might not know that that means it's a noun and that means it's the kind of word that goes at the beginning of the sentence. But the child with the language disorder would be going, aha, it's that kind of word. I know how to use that now. So, and if you're teaching a new adjective, just put a green line underneath it. The rest of the class might just think you're underlining it. But the child with the language disorder who knows the system, it will be giving them extra support without even making it obvious to the rest of the class. So, does that answer your question? Okay.
Actually, I have two questions. In the meanwhile, so first about shape coding, and the other one for the previous studies you presented. So for the shape coding, do you think, well, is there evidence in other languages than English? And do you think that we could directly apply the method to Spanish, or we should test it first and have evidence on Spanish or Catalan? So this is the first question. And regarding the previous studies, because we are very used when we are in practice to say, I cannot do research, it is very complicated, and you just show a bunch of evidences and studies using different models, different intervention models for research. And do you think there's one that should be the best, or depends on which factors?
Okay. So the first question about shape coding in other languages, there's no evidence at the moment. I know there's a group in Denmark who have applied for a grant to see if translating it into Danish, if it will be effective. The there's a group in Norway who want to translate it into Norwegian, and there's some Swedish therapists who are very interested too. So Scandinavia seems to be very, very keen, and maybe since the languages are related, they can help each other out. I don't see why it shouldn't be effective in other languages, but I think it would have to be adjusted so that it works with the grammar of that language. So, for example, I suggested for Norwegian, which would work for Spanish as well, that you could code for gender as well. So you could have solid lines for masculine and dotted lines for feminine, and you could do your adjectives and your nouns so that they agree and things like that. So you would have to make adjustments. So you'd need to know about the structure of the language and adjust the system to fit that structure. But I don't see why it shouldn't work if that's been done, but it should be obviously researched to see if it is effective, and we don't know yet. In terms of doing research in clinical practice, I think this is something that therapists should try to do all the time, because we are seeing children all the time. And even if it's only for ourselves, to convince ourselves that what we're doing works or doesn't work, then that's very useful. So the minimum is we should be measuring what we want to test before doing the intervention and measuring it again and seeing if there's any change. So I think we should be doing that all the time. The easiest thing for therapists to add to make it into a more controlled study, I think, is a baseline period. So often you would assess and then you've got a waiting list. So you can assess and then you've got your waiting time, then assess again and do your therapy. And you can compare what the change is with nothing, with the change with something. Or you've got your summer holidays or some other break that you can use as a baseline period. Or you can do the other thing that we've done, which is have the target you're working on and then measure something else at the beginning and end as well. That's your control measure. And I think that's quite feasible for therapists to do as part of their clinical practice. And if everybody started doing that and then combining their results, we'd have hundreds of studies showing us the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of therapy, and that would be fantastic. So I would really love clinicians to get involved in research. You don't have to do a huge randomized control trial. You can just do a single case study and build in a little bit of control. So I have written a paper about how clinicians can do that and what they can add in to make a study have as much control as you can feasibly do in the situation you work in. And hopefully, I hope that will encourage more people to do some research. Okay.
Thanks so much for your talk. That was so interesting. And I actually have a comment, like it really resonates with what we do with aphasia, you know, with semantic feature analysis or VNIST for treatment for verbs. So that was really interesting to see what you do with kids. But I'm very interested on your JSLHR article. So how is gain actually measured? Like, and also, like, did you use a standardized test for that? And what kind of stimuli did you use for your measurement, pre to post treatment?
So it wasn't a standardized test, it was a video test. So I videoed all my friends and family doing silly little actions, and then I would say, this is covering, and then there's a picture of my mum covering her head with a scarf, and then they have to say the lady's covering her head with a scarf. So it was all specific to the verbs that we wanted. So it was all video stimuli. So they watched the video once where I said, this is covering, and then we show it again, what's happening, and they say what's happening, and we just wrote it down, recorded it and wrote it down. So that's what the stimuli were. In terms of the way we scored it, so we didn't actually use a standard change score because the distributions of the groups were different, and there were some children with very much lower scores than everybody else. So in order to include them, we actually used what's called a normalized gain score, which is when you take the maximum they could have got, and so the maximum amount of change they could have made, the maximum amount they could make, and divide the change they did make by the maximum they could have made, so that those who had more progress to make could be compared with those who only had a small amount to make. So it's a way of balancing out when you've got big differences. So did that answer? Oh, in terms of aphasia, I just want to say there's just been a study published looking at shape coding in 2 men with aphasia. So just 2 single case studies, but that's just been published now. So. Yeah.